Imagine this for a second. What if the person put in charge of cutting government spending was also its biggest beneficiary? Today, we're diving into a source that claims to uncover a $2 trillion secret. It's a story about power, money, and a playbook that Wall Street is apparently just starting to wake up to.
Okay, so the material we're breaking down today kicks off with this really provocative question you see right here. I mean, think about it. Imagine a situation where the person being investigated is also the one running the investigation. It kind of sounds like a massive conflict of interest, right? Well, according to the analysis we're examining, this wasn't just some hypothetical thought experiment. The source lays out a story that it says isn't really about saving taxpayer money at all, but about a huge transfer of wealth happening behind the scenes, all disguised as a simple efficiency audit.
All right, so where does a story like this even begin? Well, it all started with a promise. A massive, almost unbelievable $2 trillion promise made right out on the public stage.
So, back in October of 2024, the source we're looking at highlights this incredible pledge. And you can see the appeal, right? The idea was simple, and it was powerful. A genius businessman was going to come into the government, get rid of all the waste, and save taxpayers an absolute fortune. Now, let's just try to wrap our heads around that number for a second. $2 trillion. It's just staggering. The source points out that this is more than the entire U.S. discretionary budget, the part that Congress actually gets to decide on every year. It's a figure that budget experts at the time reportedly called, and I'm quoting here, mathematically absurd.
So the big question is, what happened to that $2 trillion promise? Well, according to the source, what began as this grand mission to cut government spending very quickly started to morph into something else entirely.
This timeline really tells the story of how that promise allegedly just evaporated. I mean, you can see it right here. Within just a few short months, that $2 trillion figure was slashed again and again, with the source stating that independent fact-checkers could only ever verify a tiny fraction of that initial massive claim.
But here's the twist. The story isn't just about shrinking promises. The analysis we're explaining today highlights a completely different trend. For every single dollar in verified cuts to the government budget, the source claims the same person's companies were in line to receive nearly $4 in new government contracts.
So this slide is where the source lays out what it calls a massive conflict of interest. He was appointed to head up a brand new Department of Government Efficiency, which the material says was nicknamed Doge. But at the very same time, his companies already had billions in existing government contracts and were facing potential penalties from that very same government.
Okay, so with that alleged conflict of interest just sitting there right out in the open, the source then details what it describes as a systematic pattern, the targeting of the exact federal agencies that posed a direct threat to those business interests.
So first up, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the agency that polices Wall Street. The source alleges a really clear pattern here. While the SEC was actively investigating financial dealings, it was apparently weakened with staff cuts and buyouts right after the new appointment was made. And we see a very similar pattern laid out for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. They're the ones in charge of our vehicle safety standards. The analysis claims that right when this agency was in the middle of investigating self-driving technology, its oversight powers were reduced and its reporting rules were watered down. And the story continues, according to the source, with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. After there were clashes over investigations into SpaceX, the material we're looking at notes that the head of the agency resigned. Air safety employees were fired. And then, the FAA started considering a multi-billion-dollar contract for another one of Musk's companies, Starlink.
And it wasn't just those three. The analysis we're digging into details a consistent playbook across multiple regulatory bodies. The source claims that pretty much every single agency that was investigating Musk's companies, for everything from labor practices to racial abuse, was systematically defunded, disrupted, or, as they put it, defanged. So what's the bottom line here? What was the actual financial outcome of all this? The source quantifies what it calls the payoff, and the numbers are pretty staggering.
So first, there's this number. This is the amount in potential fines and penalties the source's analysis estimates Musk's companies avoided. Think about that. By having all those government investigations disrupted, a massive financial liability potentially just vanished. And then there's this number.
This is the value of new federal contracts his companies are now set to receive, according to the source's research. A colossal sum flowing from the exact same government he was supposed to be cutting costs for. So when you put it all together, side by side, the picture the source paints is pretty stark. It argues the so-called audit wasn't an audit at all. It claims the final result was a massive wealth transfer, with a private gain of over $48 billion, completely dwarfing the minimal public savings. But here's where the story gets bigger than just one person or one audit. The source argues this isn't a one-off event. It suggests this could be a template, a brand new playbook for how power and money operate at the highest levels. Let's take a look. Ultimately, what the source does is boil this entire complex sequence of events down to a simple four-step recipe. A playbook, it argues, for converting political influence directly into private wealth. It's that simple and that effective.
And this is the so what moment, right? The analysis we're exploring frames this as a potential paradigm shift. It warns that this model doesn't just erode public trust, it creates a two-tiered market where your political connections matter way more than your performance or innovation. And that has real human costs. So you might be asking, how does something like this happen out in the open? Well, the source argues it all comes down to the language. Words like efficiency, disruption, and cutting red tape are used to frame what could easily be seen as a massive conflict of interest as a noble public service. It's all in the branding. And that really is the final provocative thought from the material we've explained today. It suggests that a precedent has now been set, leaving all of us to consider the implications of a system where it claims you don't just lobby the government anymore, you become the government. And you have to wonder, who's going to use this playbook next?